Dylan
Awesome.
Lawhon. So
Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to have a whole bunch of questions to get to know you a little bit more and your background. So could we just start by getting just a quick introduction about who you are, and then we'll get into the questions after that?
yeah, so I'm Dylan Lawhon. My hacker handle is IDKemps, and currently I'm working as a full-time bug bounty hunter and independent security researcher, and I've been doing that for about 2.5 years now. Prior to that, I had some pen testing work as well, but yeah, that's what I'm doing now.
Nice. Thank you very much, Dylan. All right, let's get into the questions. So the first question is, when did you first start your interest in computers?
I started my interest in computers probably in like 2008, 2009, when I started playing video games on PlayStation back then. And yeah, that was really just technology in general. I didn't get my first computer until 2015 when I was in high school. And then that's whenever I actually started getting into like the technical side of things and learned my first programming language and played with some JavaScript online and stuff like that.
Nice.
That was my first when I started getting interested in computers themselves.
Cool. I'm curious what games you played and what your first computer was like.
On console, I played a lot of Call of Duty because it was around the peak time. I feel like that, the Modern Warfare 2, Black Ops 2 days. But on computer, and that was the main reason I bought a computer, was for gaming, and I was playing Counter-Strike Global Offensive at the time. So yeah.
So all FPS, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
not anymore, but that was how it was for like a decade.
Nice. I played quite a bit of those as well. And what about your first computer?
I had an iBuyPower with a AMD Radeon R9, which it was prior to, I feel like, AMD starting to produce or starting to compete with NVIDIA in graphics card and CPUs. And I remember thinking at the time that GPU was like so inexpensive, and I used that even whenever I started hacking, like 7 years later. I used that computer for a long time. It was a cheap computer, but it held on and did everything I needed it to do for a very long time. And I still have it. I've actually used it within the past year and a half.
You're still cracking passwords with it?
No, not cracking passwords, but I did use it as my work computer just for a while because I had an issue with the AIO on my current computer, and I just have it as a backup. So yeah, it works great, even like, I guess 11 years later at this point.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, I guess computers do tend to last for a while. My thing is you just max out the memory, and usually it does pretty good for a while.
Yeah.
That's usually the main bottleneck.
Yes, it is.
Cool. So let's shift. And now the second question will be, when did you first get your interest in cybersecurity?
First interest in cybersecurity was, again, from me getting into gaming. And I remember, like, specifically, there was a lot of, there still is, but back prior to 2010, there's a lot of game hackers on the big FPS games. And I remember getting in these modded and hacked lobbies on Call of Duty, and it was just very interesting to see game hackers and what they could develop in a game. And it was just like, how are people doing this, that making something completely unintentional happen on these video games? And I even remember like getting access to some mod menus and stuff to DOS people's Xboxes at the time, and I thought that was just like insanely cool and interesting that just by hitting a button, you could DOS someone's Xbox at the time.
And then
exactly. Which, not that I developed any of that. That was just like downloading free stuff
to learn about.
And I even remember specifically in, I think it was 2011 or something, when there was about a 3-week span where the PSN servers went offline because of a big PSN hack at the time. And that was, crazy to me because I was big into gaming at the time. And I remember it going offline for like 3 weeks, and I actually swapped to Xbox at that time. So that's what got me into Xbox, because the PlayStation services were down. But yeah, that's when I got an interest
in cybersecurity. They were down
for
3 weeks?
Yeah, I think it was 2011.
Wow.
They brought the servers down for 3 weeks, and it was a huge ordeal at the time. And they ended up like compensating a lot of their users and stuff.
Yeah.
after
Wow.
that. But that was when I really got into it. But I didn't get into actual offensive security and starting to get into hacking until that weird point in high school where you're like, okay, I'm about to graduate high school. Like, I gotta figure out what I want to do with the rest of my life. And so I just started thinking like, okay, what do I like? And computers came to mind, and I was like, what do I want to do with computers? And then I started thinking about it and thought that cybersecurity sounded interesting. So I started reading about it more online and figured out that you could do offensive security ethically and legally. And so I just got on board with that real quick. And then that became like my new hobby at the time and just started
Did it
spending all my
replace video
time.
games?
It did replace video games for a while and still has today. So I ended up loving it. I was doing a lot more of the gamified like CTFs and stuff, and I did that for years. It was just a lot of fun, and I
Yeah.
learned a lot about it from that.
So you'd go like CTF time and just sign up part of a CTF team maybe, or?
I had done teams. My main one was Hack the Box at the time. Back whenever they had it's a completely new platform today, but it was back when they had like you had to hack your way in to get an account on there, which I think they've removed at this point to make it more beginner friendly and everything. And I remember, competing on all the new challenges and remembering their release times and trying to first blood them. And I started doing that. Yeah, I've played on teams and I've played it in-person CTFs with teams from college. And I got a scholarship for a SANS scholarship from placing high on one of the SANS CTFs, which ended up getting me like 4 SANS certifications or 3 of them.
That is not cheap stuff.
Yeah, nothing I would have ever bought on my own, but it was nice to have and explore for free.
Yeah, SANS has good stuff. It is expensive, and
yeah,
that's awesome that you were able to do that and get those. Awesome. Let's move on to the next question. What is the coolest hack, or one of? Because I know you have many, many cool hacks, but what's one of the coolest hack that you've pulled off you'd like to share with us? Keeping clients anonymous, obviously.
Yeah, I'd say after I started getting into bug bounty my sophomore year of college, I got like heavily into that, started spending all of my time doing bug bounty and ended up getting invited to a live hacking event, which normally they're in person, and I've been to in-person ones since then. But at the time, it was right during COVID, so it ended up being a virtual live hacking event. So I didn't get to travel. But yeah, and I just mentioned this because I think it's one of the coolest things, not simply because of the technical aspects, but the whole atmosphere and the whole story behind it.
The whole experience?
Yeah, but to continue with the story, I ended up getting invited to this live hacking event with, it was about 30 hackers total, off like the 30 top hackers at the time from Integrity, and which is the platform, not the actual client. And the client like gave us this talk about the technology we were going to be hacking on the, during the onboarding, just to give everyone an idea of what it was. And they were talking about how it's not just, some random application they have, but it actually backs the like financial industry of an entire European country. And so it is like a big ideal or application that has real impact, and they've even been targeted by like APTs in the past just because it's a big part of the financial infrastructure of one of the countries. And so he really set the scene of being like, okay, this is important. So finding stuff on this really matters. And they did very much care about the vulnerabilities. And so once we started looking at this application, and I was on a team at the time of 4, and I'll just give them a shout out real quick. It was Holme, Banjes, and Floer. All of that, those are their hacker handles.
Awesome.
And we started looking at this application along with the 30 other hackers that were there, and it was pretty locked down, and there wasn't a bunch of, from a technical standpoint, there's obviously like authorization and issues and stuff, but when it comes to like the classic things you think of high impact vulnerabilities, there was only one feature that really stood out to us, and that was the invoice generation, which had user supplied input in it.
Okay.
And we were sure, because you have, 30 good hackers there, we were sure everyone else was going to be looking at the same functionality because there had already been a lot of research behind HTML or HTML to PDF generation, and there being SSRF possibilities there. And so we were in this sort of scenario where we had control over the HTML used to generate these PDFs, and we figured everyone else is going to be looking at this, so somebody's going to find something. And we kept poking and poking for days and couldn't find anything. It didn't seem like anyone else was finding anything. And we ended up finding that it was using a closed source. It wasn't something they developed, but it was a closed source third-party application to generate it on the back end. And we couldn't get any HTML injection to continue with getting SSRF on the back end. But we did start looking into the documentation for this third-party service, and they had some custom CSS attributes and stuff just for this rendering. And it was not standard HTML or CSS, so we're like, okay, this is very interesting. And we never ended up getting HTMLI to try and get SSRF on the back end, but we did find a spot to get CSS injection, which when it comes to client-side stuff, that's not normally something I look for. Not that it can't be impactful, and there's been a lot of cool research around it recently, but it's not something I generally look for because the impact is usually pretty limited.
Right, you can make the font bigger and things like that.
Right, but when it came to this being rendered on the back end of the server, it did become interesting. And we found one of these custom CSS attributes to be it was something that had like script in the name. And so we're like, okay, this is interesting. And so it was meant to embed JavaScript within the PDF that would be executed by like Adobe and stuff.
Oh man. So they let you inject JavaScript in the CSS.
In the CSS.
A custom CSS property.
Yeah. But on the back end, it wouldn't actually execute the JavaScript itself. It was meant for like the JS execution environment in Adobe and stuff. So that would still end up being like a weird client side issue where they'd have to open it in Adobe. So we're like, we need something that's relevant at the time. And we ended up finding that we could set, even though it wasn't documented in the documentation, you didn't have to set it to a local file or inline JavaScript. You could actually set it to like
remote.
Yes, like an HTTPS target or a file scheme. And so we ended up getting full SSRF, full read SSRF and LFI via this little vulnerability, this 0-day in the HTML to PDF renderer. And from there, we were able to prove that we could hit an internal unauthenticated Elastic instance that we could just query anybody's session on the application. So it's like a account takeover of all the accounts.
You were able to get the session cookie and then log in?
It just had the full request.
Full
so we could
circle.
Just grab, And then also we found one other internal API that was just meant to be hit internally and not by the application, that could query all application data and for other applications. And so we figured that was enough impact to prove it was a crit or an exceptional, how Integrity does it. And we sent that in, and they ended up triaging it, and they recognized the impacts, and we ended up getting like most impactful team award at the event because of that vulnerability. And it did turn out that no one else had found any sort of HTML injection or CSS injection at the end of the live hacking event. So it was just that small little, it was just a small little CSS injection that most people never look at because it's not that impactful usually. But in this context, it ended up being a very interesting 0-day that led to some very real impacts.
Yeah, for sure. Starting from like the lowest, chaining a whole bunch of stuff to basically, if you're able to impersonate any users by stealing any session from Elasticsearch, I think you said, right?
Yeah.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Can you actually recap the chain? It starts with...
Yeah, I can do that. It just started with a custom invoice layout where you could change the color of the invoice, like font and stuff. And we found that was using CSS attributes and directives to do that. And we found that we could inject out of the scope of the CSS that we were supposed to be sending to the server. And then from that CSS injection, we found a custom CSS attribute that was created by the third-party PDF renderer And from there, we found LFI and SSRF on one of those custom attributes, and we hit internal applications and APIs from there.
Nice. Very cool. This made me think of something that I've learned over time, right? That I noticed you mentioned is that you actually looked at the documentation. And if you're like me, you probably looked at the right version of the documentation,
Yes.
right? Because that often very matters. You could look at this version or that version, and this version has this one new feature or this new parameter that was not there before.
Yep.
If you're not looking at the exact version, you might miss that. And that might be your point of entry right there.
Definitely.
So I thought that was interesting. You mentioned that you looked up the documentation, used it. I feel sometimes people might not do that enough.
Yep. And you're right about the documentation. Like and sometimes they'll archive the old documentation or make it hidden to where you can't normally see it. But because I've came across the same HTML to PDF render since then in a bug bounty program, found out the version they were using, and saw that, oh yeah, it's a more updated version. Went and looked at the documentation, and the CSS attribute we found the 0 day in years ago, they had like explicitly removed completely from how they do things. And yeah, if you weren't looking at the right version, then you would just be like, oh, that doesn't exist.
Right,
So
exactly.
you never tried it.
Yeah, if you just go look at the latest documentation, very cool. Awesome. That was a great one. Next one is what's your favorite type of security testing and why?
For me, it's always been code review, and that could come in really any form. That could be just straight up where you're shared the source code of an application, or what it generally is for me, since I do a lot of web hacking, or bug bounty hunting in general, which is a lot of web. It's a lot of analyzing the client side JavaScript, and then if there's an accompanying desktop application, which a lot of the applications I hack there is, then it would be decompiling that desktop application into, if it's a .NET application, you could get some beautiful .NET from like the .peak file or application, or
IL-Spy or any of those.
all of those. So it really just comes down to getting access to the code, and that's where you can start finding some very interesting and technically interesting vulnerabilities that normally just from black box testing you'd never find the vulnerability. And even if you did find, oh, something's off here, you wouldn't be able to build like a full exploit chain with it, which is a lot of times how things happen in black box testing. So yeah, I like analyzing the code, and you can really come up with some very interesting vulnerability chains and exploitation paths from having the code in front of you.
That's interesting. There's actually, and I also do, obviously, when you use code, you can definitely find a lot more. I'm curious about your preferred approach. There's many different ways to do code reviews, right? You can try to do every single line of code from top to bottom, which in my opinion, probably never going to work well. You can try to run tools, and then based on what the tools give you, pick some focus area and look at that. Another thing too is like, I see some people, they do code review and they just look at the code and that's it. I like to be able to build and run and debug the code, so that when I see something in the code at runtime, I can like play with it and confirm it. I'm just curious kind of how you approach code reviews.
Yeah, just like you just mentioned, if I've been given enough code to actually set up the application or service on my own, then that's going to be my first objective, and getting it set up and running, because a lot of times you'll see, or it'll just make verifying attack surface and stuff a lot easier. So I'll get it set up first, and then it really comes down to how much time I have. If it's a pen test and I only have 2 weeks, my approach is going to be a lot different than if I'm doing bug bounty and I have an unlimited amount of time. But most of my code reviews done on like bug bounty targets where I have a lot of time, and I'll usually, it obviously depends on the language and how much coverage I want, if it's a massive application or not. But I will figure out, or I'll just trace sources to sinks. And so I'll look where user input to the application can be, what kind of user input goes into this. And that's language dependent when you go looking through the code. And then I'll just trace that through the application. If I have enough time, I'll literally start from the source being like just as an example, for a web application, a source would be like a header that you could send to the server, or a URL parameter, or, a body parameter. And I'll look at that in the code and trace it through all of it, all the functions that it goes through, and see where it ends up in the application.
And then sometime maybe on the path, you'll find some interesting things as well, right?
Exactly. And if I have a lot of time, I'll do that. And if I don't have a lot of time, I'll usually do it the opposite way, where I'll look for the sinks, like dangerous sinks that could lead to SSRF or LFI, or, deserializing data. And I'll look at the dangerous sinks first, and then I'll trace them and see if any sinks touch that on the way. You don't get as much coverage that way, but if I'm doing something quick, I feel like for me, that's proved to be the best.
It allows you to prioritize what you're going to look at as opposed to doing comprehensive. Right. Actually, that's a super interesting topic, is the time management between a pen test versus bug bounty. Like how, if you're doing a pen test, let's say you're doing a 2-week pen test versus you're doing a bug bounty, how would you manage your time on one versus the other?
Yeah, so especially if you have the 2 weeks of testing on a pen test versus 2 weeks to pen test and do your report, you really get on a tight time crunch. And I find with pen tests, they're usually looking for full coverage of the application, even if it's thin. In my experience, the client would much prefer you get to the end of the pen test, and if they're like, well, did you check this area of the application? They want to hear a yes.
Yeah.
They'd rather see that than you would send them one singular vulnerability on the entire report that's a crit, in my experience, right. Which isn't the same for bug bounty. But with bug bounty, I really just slow down, because I have, usually an infinite amount of time that I could spend on it. And I just, do things the slow and thorough way. And that's where I end up finding vulnerabilities that other hackers who aren't spending as much time on it, they're going to miss. And the developers are going to miss, because it's a complex bug, and all of the automated tooling, both from bug bounty hunters and internally, like, the code review tools, security code review tools, stuff that's going to miss. So I want to hit that stuff, and it often takes longer than just doing a quick look at the code to find that sort of stuff. And just like the main application target that I hack on now in bug bounty, I've been working on for 2.5 years, literally since I started full time. And I still hack on them every day and find stuff that I was looking right at 2 years ago and I just didn't see. And now,
attend our Agentic Pentest demo and receive a free pen test for your organization. Many businesses think their pen test covers everything, but hidden vulnerabilities remain. With Turbo Pentest, you can request a live demo and see how our platform identifies gaps, risks, and actionable fixes in real time. Stop guessing. Make smarter security decisions. Protect your business before attackers find the gaps. Experience Turbo Pentest in action today. Request your demo now.
You know, 2.5 years later, looking at the same thing with a better idea of the application, I'm like, wow, I can't believe I'm just seeing this.
Yeah. So that highlight the importance, like even unless you have the smallest pen test, there's no pen test that's going to cover everything. It's more about something you do on an ongoing basis to remove some of the risk. But nobody's going to, you've been working on one app for over 2 years. That just proves the point. There's always more to look at, more to try. If somebody tells you they're done with a target that's anything but extremely small, even the small one, you can still try. Yeah. There's always more to do and to try. So cool.
Definitely.
And the bug bounty did just prove that out. After a while looking at something, you'll find some of the best and the most advanced attacks because you had the time to spend on it. Cool. Next question is, what's something you think everybody can do to get better results to get better results when they're security testing? Maybe they're not. We talked about documentation earlier. Maybe something else.
That's definitely something. But I would say in general, just because this is a lot of times the issues I see when it comes to bug bounty or pen testing or any format of security, is the person that found the vulnerability not being able to actually articulate the impacts of that vulnerability. And for one, that just hurts you in regards to, is this a vulnerability or not? Like, if you can't answer what the impact of it is, then you shouldn't be putting it in a report as anything but informative, in my opinion, if there's no true impact. And it also just, for the person that's going to fix it, if you can't articulate the impact, then they're not going to know how to classify the severity of it. They're not going to know if they're going to prioritize it, and they may not fix it if you can't even, actually tell them what the impact of something is. So it really doesn't, I see a lot of times hackers, from the offensive side, that especially beginners, they'll like come and ask, hey, is this a vulnerability? This looks weird. If you ask them first question, what's the impact? And they're like, I don't know. Then I would say it's not, right now we need to explore it further. But yeah, I think getting into the mindset where you should always be looking to be able to actually tell a client or put in a report, hey, this is the impact of this vulnerability. Here's why it's important, and here's why I'm saying it's, a medium, high, or critical. Then that's very important, both in regards to advocating for yourself and what you say is accurate, and it's important for the people that are fixing those issues so that they can have an actual good understanding of the impact.
Yeah, actually, not alarming a buyer, is important. If you have something that's truly a low or medium, and you don't want to send a critical and high and then alert people and then go through a fire drill and a lot of back and forth and eventually find out that it's really not that big of a deal.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So good stuff. I agree. That is definitely something a lot of people can spend some time and improve on, spending more time thinking through severities, putting yourself in the shoes of the buyer, the client, what truly matters to them. Not because it's SQL injection that it's always higher critical, right?
Right. Definitely.
Cool. Next one, shifting a little bit about AI, the hot topic these days. How are you using AI in your work today? Are you using AI?
Yeah. I do use AI quite a bit. I didn't that much just a year ago. I didn't think it was nearly as helpful, and that kind of comes down to how quickly it's advancing. It's actually insane.
I think it wasn't.
Yeah, exactly. And so right now I'm kind of using it, I would say, three main ways. I'm using it for quick development of some of my recon automation, just when it's not something that's a production ready application that I'm selling to people, and I just need to write some code that performs and does exactly what I need it to do, and it's just me that's using it. And if there's an issue, that's okay, because no one's depending on it. I'll just go fix it. Writing up some quick code using AI to help me do something that previously would have taken me days, and it can get something working in an hour or less. It's extremely
so you're
helpful.
Tools and POCs.
Yeah, mainly tools. I've had it help with some POCs on some client side issues and stuff. But yeah, when it comes to writing code, it's usually for my automation and quick scripts. I also use it for an interesting thing I've done recently, because I have an application that has very, very extensive documentation, both from a general business, here's what this application does, and then also from a technical standpoint, it has documentation on the different, APIs and the front end versus the back end and how it interacts. And I've been able to give Claude this documentation that's 700-page PDF, and it converts it to text. And I just simply ask it, give me some ideas on attack vectors, and it just goes based on the language of, if the documentation says this shouldn't happen, or it leaves something out, then it actually does a pretty decent job of giving me these ideas on different attack vectors or things that they could have potentially left out, that I have it run through that documentation that I would never be able to get through just like reading top to bottom.
Oh yeah, there's no way.
Yeah, and it can give me some actually interesting things to try. And sometimes they do actually work, and it's something that, unless I was spending months on the application, I probably never would have even thought about trying, but it can generate some pretty interesting attack vectors.
Very cool. New, unique ideas. Awesome. So how do you see AI changing cybersecurity in the near future, both on the offense and on the defense?
Yeah, I think those go hand in hand, and that kind of goes into what we were talking about a second ago. Like, it's crazy how fast this is improving. Just a
Yeah.
year ago, whenever I attempted to use it for offensive stuff, I was like, it feels like I got to babysit it or kind of handhold a lot. So let me just do this manually. But now it does, it's actually very good at, certain things, especially when it has the actual code in front of it. It can work out really well. And so I think from an offensive side, it automates a lot of the, like what I was talking about earlier, the quick script generation or, generating POCs for different issues, just some really simple code. Like, it can pump that out in minutes and have something working. It's good in many ways for offense. I could keep going, but I think on defense, I've seen, I have friends that just do software engineering and development, and they talk about how they're getting it implemented into the actual development pipeline itself, both not just in regards to help build applications, but also, having specialized agents and stuff just to do security review, incrementally throughout the development process. And I think that'll be, just absolutely huge if you could get coverage. Not that it's going to find absolutely everything, but it's definitely better than having nothing at all, or just one person that's, focusing on the security. If you can just get eyes on that code, security, minded eyes, the entire development process, I think that's going to be huge when it comes to application security specifically, but that kind of branches into a lot of the other realms as well.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is we're continuing to shift left and try to do as much as early as we can. And I think penetrate testing, triple pen test can do this actually. You can set up a GitHub action and it'll run a pen test on every deployment if you'd like, or you can schedule it and run it once a month. And it will be a full agentic pen test that you can either participate in or let it do its thing and it'll give you a report. And like you said, I don't think it's one thing to replace everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
We still need different layers. So, yeah, I agree. I think that's going to be interesting to see how developers use these things more and more to test more early and more in depth than what they were able to do before.
Exactly.
Cool. Next is what is the biggest misconception people have about security testing?
I would say, and I had this misconception myself while getting into it, that it's all, security testing and like just technical work, or even the majority of, you may think the majority of it is that, but a lot of it is, kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. It's not just, hacking when it comes to the offensive side, but it's also, writing reports that are actually gonna convey why the work that you're doing matters, and, tells them truly, gives an accurate assessment of the impact of the stuff that you're finding so that they can actually act on the stuff that you're finding. And so that's one thing going into like pen testing. Whenever I was just someone getting into hacking and enjoyed it a lot, and then you get a pen test role and you realize, okay, I'm like spending like 50% of my time hacking, if that. The other time is in meetings conveying, how we're going to do this pen test, or here's the results of the pen test, here's why it matters. And then you're also, writing reports and stuff that is the actual deliverable that you're giving the client. So it matters just as much as the actual hacking itself. And so that's kind of the biggest misconception, I think, out there in regards to security testing, and definitely one that I had initially.
Yeah, I agree. You could be the best pen tester in the world and have the best findings in the world, but if you're not able to communicate it to the buyer, then there's no value being created.
Yeah,
absolutely. The whole value is in that pen test report or advice, and it being accurate, prioritize accurately. Cool. Next one is what's a vulnerability or attack vector, or maybe even technique that people are underestimating and not using enough these days?
This is actually an interesting topic, because that's kind of what you look for in bug bounty, is these weird things that
I was just thinking about that. You can't give us all your secrets, but maybe one.
But I'll give one it's earned me a lot of money, and it's interesting because it's not actually a vulnerability, and it's really never exploitable on its own. It's always part of a chain, but I've literally made probably over 100K off of this one little technique and knowledge, and it's something that no one really looks for. And it's in regards to SAML authentication, and we see it all the time, even if you don't realize you're looking at it. But there's so much SAML being used these days, and even with, using it for SSO and stuff, but I see it all the time. And one of the things, whenever you start reading about how to implement it, is you start hearing about defining an audience in the auth request for these SAML assertions and responses in it. And it's something that if you go look up SAML hacking or something like that, and you get a list of things to look at, you'll start seeing look for XSC because it's, an XML blob, or looking at signature confusion and stuff like that. But you almost never see stuff about the audience itself because it's never directly exploitable. But in a scenario where you have the service provider initiated authentication and it's not checking the audience, well, then you could authenticate to one service provider and then use it to authenticate to the IDP. And it's supposed to return, the auth for, let's say, service provider 1. But you can just relay that to service provider 2 if service provider 2 doesn't check the audience of that SAML request. And if it doesn't check it, then you're going to be authenticated into service provider 2 with, the details from the original SAML response. And where that's interesting and how you actually exploit it is, something like, if you have a email verification bypass on service provider 1 and you're able to register, a victim's email, like if a victim exists on service provider 2, you sign up with their email on service provider 1, and then you use
log in there.
Yeah,
and use your token over there.
Exactly. You just use your SAML token to authenticate into the victim's account on service provider 2, since it doesn't pay attention to the audience within the SAML response.
When SAML was new, I actually built all of this stuff back then for SAML. And if I remember correctly, the audience URI, basically if you're not in that list, it's not going to issue any SAML token to you, right? That's kind of like the white list to allow the issuance.
Yep.
Is that right? Okay.
That's part of it. And and whenever the IDP responds with a SAML response for the authentication of one service provider, it includes in the audience, hey, this is supposed to be used on service provider 1. And so service provider 1 is supposed to check, well, this was issued to me. Let me look at the assertions and authenticate the user. But oftentimes what I see is it doesn't check the audience. It'll just check the assertions and say, oh, this is signed by the IDP. It's trusted. It wasn't generated by the user, but it's not for me, but I didn't look at that. So it's actually for a different service provider.
Okay. So it actually doesn't even check the audience at all.
Yeah, it could check it, and it maybe, I don't really know what's happening on the back end. It could check and say, this is on a list of the service providers that the IDP has configured. Let's let them in. Or the service provider maybe just doesn't have a check at all and is not making sure that it's for itself.
Nice. Yep, that is definitely something we don't see enough of or a lot of. Yeah. And it is definitely an interesting bug.
It's an interesting bug that turns something like, an email verification bypass, where it is a bug clearly, but when you go back to what's the impact of it, you could say there's a small impact of, well, now the user can't register their own account because I have their email. In reality, they could just reset the password of it. But it would turn something simple like that, that's either informative or a low, into a no user interaction account takeover, which would be, a critical impact finding. And so it's a good thing to chain with small impact findings. And I've used this so many times on bug bounty and even in pentest as well, whenever there's SAML authentication in use.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that, actually. It's probably easier to find on bug bounties than pentest, because often you'd have to have two IDPs or service provider.
Yeah, and
the same scope.
You would have to be paying attention to scope, and a lot of time you wouldn't have one application in scope but the other. So it's definitely something that the freedom of bug bounty you'll see a lot more.
Actually, one of the things I like to do when we do pen tests, and that, is to bundle multiple applications together for exactly that reason. Yeah. Because a lot of the time, it doesn't make sense testing in isolation, because sometimes the admin tool will take data from the public site and display it, and that you can target the admin and just like your example right now, if the test would be in isolation, it would not be possible to cover it on a pen test. But now, if you have the multiple service provider, then you would be able to.
Yeah, that's definitely the way to do it. The best
Cool.
way to get value out of pen test or any way you're setting up some security like that.
Yep. Test things that work together.
Yep. Exactly.
And that's actually the same philosophy behind hardware tests, where you take the mobile app, the website, the hardware itself, and everything, and test it all together. Okay, cool, fun stuff. Actually, that's the last question. Then I'll have a bonus question. So the last question: if someone wants to break into cybersecurity today in 2026, what would be one piece of advice you'd have for them?
Yeah, that would be the same if I would have answered any year, really. And it is a controversial topic, but I would say learn to build things first. Learn how learn programming, even though a lot of what you read says that maybe you don't have to. And I know you don't have to make money in this sphere, but it'll greatly help you if you learn how to program and learn how to build things that you're going to eventually try to break. That'll help in every way, finding vulnerabilities, displaying impact, everything like that.
Building your own tools.
Yep.
And then understanding. Yeah, actually, that's one of the things I always found fascinating is then when a pen tester finds a SQL injection, but then they're not able to fully exploit it because they don't understand SQL.
Yeah. And I've seen that a lot too. And it's like if SQL map can't exploit it, then I'll report it as a crit because people say it's a crit, but I don't really know what it's happening on the back end. And it's interesting because I find a lot of SQL injection actually, and it's one of my most paid vulnerabilities. And I never, not once have I used SQL map. And I have used it actually twice before, and it was after I'd already exploited the vulnerability and to see, okay, will SQL map find this? And if it does find something's fishy, will it be able to exploit it to confirm it? And both times it wasn't able to find it. And then those were for straightforward injection points, and that wasn't like I've had cases where it's behind a WAF and I have to use completely custom payloads and slowly build out a payload that's going to bypass the WAF as well. And yeah, if you don't have an understanding of SQL but you're trying to exploit SQL injection, you just can't do it. And that goes for so many things, not just SQL, but having an understanding of what's going on the back end is such a help. And almost the whole time I'm hacking, I'm picturing, what does the code look like on the back end? And that helps all the time understanding complex vulnerabilities.
Yep. Specifically on the SQL injection, going back to what we were talking about earlier, looking at documentation, that's something I found super helpful with SQL injection, because if you're able to figure out what version of SQL you're dealing with, what the server is, and even sometimes the language itself has a different version than the server, right?
Yep.
So if you're able to find out which SQL version you're working with and look at that documentation, then you can be certain you have full coverage of everything that's available to you. And very often you'll find something that nobody's ever tested or written about, that it's right there in the documentation, looks suspicious, and jump on that.
Yeah, and that's one more thing to add to that, just because it's an interesting topic and you just brought it up, finding out the documentation. When you get, SQL injection, although the beginning part of it, or like injecting a quote or, some sort of statement or something may look the same, exploitation always comes down to, what SQL isn't the same, what's on the back end. Is it MySQL? Is it MS SQL? Is it Oracle? Like, what are you actually injecting into? And that'll completely change how you have to go about exploiting the vulnerability itself. And so understanding the documentation and how to fingerprint what's on the back end based on what functions exist in MySQL versus Oracle, that's the easiest way to do it, is to have a huge list of how those different DBMSs handle the SQL and how they implement their functions and stuff. So
nice.
Yeah, definitely interesting.
Very cool. Do you have your own database fingerprinting tool?
I have my own database fingerprinting methodology. I don't like developing tools for something like this just because I feel like a lot of the stuff, SQL injection, I find is, just like I was mentioning, like it's very weird or sometimes even second order stuff. And I can write in a script later to exploit it. But for fingerprinting, I just have a methodology that I have written down. And that's just really what functions and what syntax exists in this language versus this. or not language,
Right.
but DBMS, and it's for a bunch of the common ones. And so if I find something that accepts this Boolean statement as true and the others don't work, then I can say, okay, it's for sure this DBMS.
That makes sense. Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing all this, Dylan. That's pretty much it on all the general question. The last question, the bonus question, is simply, where can people find you and follow your work?
They can find me on X, just as iQuimps or iKimps, which is IQIMPZ, and then LinkedIn as Dylan Lawhon, my full name. I don't currently post like really anything in regards to blogs or research. That's a flaw that I recognize. I definitely should be sharing some of the stuff, but I just do what I love, which is hacking, and I don't really share a bunch of stuff right now, which I know I should be, but yeah.
We'll definitely love to hear more from you, Dylan. A lot of very fascinating insights from you today. I really appreciate you jumping in and chatting with us, sharing some of your thoughts, and hopefully we can get again together in the future and chat some more.
Yep. Thanks for having me. It was a good time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dylan, and take care.
Thanks.
See you.